If you ever made the decision to get sober, perhaps you went into treatment or you started attending Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, then you know firsthand how challenging the process can be. Usually by the time our relationship with substances really begins to turn bad, our outlook upon life is bleak. And so there's a hope that if we get sober, things are going to magically get better. And while for many people the quality of their life does improve, just stopping drinking or stop using drugs doesn't necessarily make things better. You have to work at it. So what happens if you have been sober for a while, but really don't feel good and start wondering, gee, was I better off drinking and drugging? So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about some of the common reasons that people feel that way in recovery. But more importantly, what you can do to address these issues so that not only can you stay sober, but you can feel good about your sobriety. Now is always the time to start making positive changes in your life. Dr. Donna, Leigh, Bliss here. On this channel, I promote optimal mental health and well-being to help you become the best version of yourself. Please help me to grow this channel by clicking on the subscribe button. Getting sober. On TV shows and in the movies, it sounds like a wonderful thing that happens. You go through a rough patch and then magically your life gets better and you walk off into the sunset. Well, it doesn't really work that way. So what happens if you have a period of time of sobriety, 6 months, a year, multiple years, and you start wondering if it was worth it? You start thinking that, gee, my life was better when I was drinking and drugging. And you start seriously considering going back out and using again. All too often people do this because this is a fairly common experience people have at some point in their sobriety. The problem is most people don't necessarily understand what is triggering them to do that. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the common factors that can cause people to reach that point where they wonder if sobriety is worth it. But more importantly, steps you can take to help you deal with these issues and keep growing in your life. So getting sober is hard enough. You have to go through withdrawal. If it's alcohol, you may have the shakes or be very irritable or have trouble concentrating. You may have intense cravings to use. Now all of a sudden you're faced with a life where your number one coping mechanism you don't have. Life was easier when you're drinking and drugging. Whatever the issue that comes up, you just pick up a drink or a drug and you don't deal with it. So early sobriety is challenging because you have to learn new skills to cope. And for many people, they have a hard time doing that. But what happens once you get over that initial hump? You get through acute alcohol withdrawal and your cravings aren't so bad, but then all of a sudden you just don't feel like sobriety is all that special. So let's talk about what happens after the beginning. So one of the number one challenges with people that are relatively early on is called post-acute withdrawal. This is not the acute withdrawal, having the shakes, craving a drink that you have, upon immediately stopping drinking. But this can happen weeks or months after you had your last drink or drug. And what happens is your brain has to really recalibrate itself. It doesn't really know how to think clearly. It's been anesthetized with substances. Your coping skills have been really pretty poor. You've relied on a substance so that you don't have to deal with issues. So it can be a real jolt to our nervous system when we start confronting life without a substance. So what happens is people can have really uncomfortable post-acute withdrawal symptoms. They can feel very irritable, have difficulty thinking clearly. They can have sleep problems. They can over or underreact to stress. And it can feel so crazy-making that many people think there's something wrong with them. And so they have a tendency to relapse even after months of sobriety. So one of the things that's important is just to understand that if you're still relatively early on, even though you may have gotten past the physical aspects of withdrawal, the psychological and emotional aspects can take a little bit longer. The next common challenge is white knuckling it. This typically concerns people who try to quit on their own. Maybe they don't want to go to AA or go to church or get help, and they just think through willpower they can mentally push their way through not picking up a drink. Now, some people can do that, but oftentimes there's so much fear and pressure, and they feel so miserable that they start thinking, what is the point? And they go back out. So white knuckling it is really just trying to rely on our willpower to create a new way of living, to create a sober life. And in my experience working in the addictions field for over 30 years, I've met many people, clients, who had been white knuckling it, and they would say, Dr. Donna, I haven't had a drink in 2 years and I feel crazier now than I did then. What's wrong with me? And so we talk about how they don't have a support group, they're relying solely on their own resources, and they're reaching a breaking point where if they don't make a change, they're going to start using again. Another common factor that can cause people to really sour on being sober is other addictions. There's sort of a common belief that you should let go of your addictions in the order that they're killing you. So many people will stop drinking, but they overeat, they smoke, they may have sexual issues, and in the initial sobriety, there's a tendency to overlook them. But if you've been sober for quite a while, you might find that these other addictions are really clashing with your lifestyle. They may be causing health problems such as smoking. And so a lot of times when people are having increasingly difficult living a sober life in one area, but still having an addictive relationship in another, that it reaches a boiling point where something has to give. And if people don't understand that, they can oftentimes go back to drinking or drugging again. So you may be struggling because it's time to start quitting smoking, or it's time to lose some weight and look at your relationship with food, or maybe you've been spending impulsively, or maybe you have a bit of a gambling problem. So frequently people will find that there are other addictive disorders that they have, which is very common for people who have an addiction to alcohol or drugs, and then it's time really to start to address those issues. One of the more common factors that make people so miserable that they start thinking about drinking or drugging again is the avoidance of existential issues. What does that mean? Well, I work quite often with people that have been sober a long time. Maybe they work a good program in Narcotics Anonymous, but they just feel miserable. And when I explore with them about what getting clean and sober meant, about what goals they have in their life, frequently they talk about, well, I always wanted to go back to school, but I don't think I'm good enough, or I wanted to start a business, or maybe I want to start a family. And so a lot of times what happens is after a period of years in sobriety, these existential issues start popping up and people start resisting them, usually because they're afraid or they're unsure of themselves. And so they try to push them down. And the reality is it's very difficult to stay sober while you're avoiding addressing these other issues. And so you might find, if you're struggling with your sobriety, that maybe it's because your long-held desire to go to school is now coming up again, and it's time for you to start taking action, doing that. Another common area that really throws people off is unresolved childhood abuse issues. Adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families is a very common phenomenon for people in recovery. Many people grew up in alcoholic families and they learned coping skills, people pleasing, approval seeking, being afraid of authority figures that really don't mesh well with living a sober life. A lot of times they're very shame-based, they just don't feel they're good enough or they belong, and those issues can start coming up to the point where if you don't start dealing with them, you run the risk of relapsing again. Issues about childhood sexual abuse can come up too, and this can blindside people sometimes if they've been sober for a couple years or so. And so a lot of times, if you're really struggling with not feeling good about your sobriety, it could be that those issues now are starting to come up and now it's time to start to address them. So when we look at these common issues, it raises a question, so what do I do about them? You might be identifying with a lot of talking about. You might be thinking, okay, I've been having memories of being sexually abused as a child. I don't know if it's true or not. What do I do? Or, yeah, I've been white knuckling it, but I really don't know how to work the AA program. So how do I get started? So I want to talk to you a little bit about action steps that you can start taking today that will help you to feel better in addressing these issues so that you can feel good about yourself, good about your sobriety, and your life can stay, going forward in a positive direction. One of the most important ways to cope with all these kinds of stressors is to look at your self-care. When I work with clients, it is always amazing to me how self-care is something people don't think about. They're not proactive about it. They don't eat healthy, they don't exercise, they don't do fun things. Maybe they do something fun now and then, or they might meditate now and then, but they don't really take good care of themselves as a matter of course. And I know from practical experience working with many clients that when you start being proactive about self-care, you start feeling better. Your ability to be more optimistic gets stronger. Your ability to problem solve gets stronger. And so even if you're not sure why you're not feeling good, just working and improving your self-care can make a huge difference in helping you feel more optimistic about your life. Let's say that you've been sober in AA and you don't like going to meetings, you're resentful, and you start telling yourself the program doesn't work. Well, I will tell you from talking with clients, living a sober life is challenging. There's a lot of changes that you have to make and maintain. But one of the things I've learned from clients that tell me, sometimes when they reach a roadblock, they realize they really weren't working the program. They haven't been working the steps. They haven't been talking to a sponsor. When they go to meetings, they don't really share what's going on, so they've been more isolative. And as a result, they start to disconnect from the program and all the support it provided them at one time. So if you're struggling with just this sort of general sense of malaise that, sobriety doesn't seem worth it, then it may be you just need to really look at how you work your program. Maybe you need to make some major changes about it. And that might be a great thing to talk to other people if you go to NA or AA about how do they cope with those kind of issues. And when you start making those changes, you can start feeling better. If you start identifying with the notion of growing up in an alcoholic or dysfunctional family, it can be pretty overwhelming when those feelings come up. So the good news is that there's a 12-step support group, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families, that focuses on that. So if you're sober in AA or NA or Overeaters Anonymous or something like that, then you'll feel comfortable with ACA because it uses the same 12 steps and it has a very similar focus on recovery. I work with so many clients that present with challenges in their life and not feeling good about their sobriety, and it's because of these issues. And I refer them to ACA, and they talk about how initially it's pretty overwhelming emotionally, but they relate to it. And they start working the program, and they tell me time and time again how much better they feel about themselves because they realize how those childhood experiences have been holding them back in their lives, and now they don't have to stay stuck anymore. So if that's coming up for you, check out the website, adultchildren.org. Maybe sit in on a few meetings. I think you can find this to be a game changer in helping you to really embrace being sober and feeling optimistic about your life. Finally, if you have more overwhelming issues that are coming up, such as being sexually abused or some trauma background, or maybe you need help with how do I go to school, how do I apply, then working with a life coach or a therapist can really help. I think it's important to work with somebody that has experience working with people in recovery because they can understand the challenges and they can help you problem solve. I've been fortunate as a clinical social worker to work with many people like that and help them navigate the pathway to going to school, because I know firsthand from my own experiences how daunting that task was, but I also found a way to do that. And so when you help people problem solve, they get more hope. And if you're working with a therapist, if you have an emotional abuse background or a sexual abuse background, it can be pretty overwhelming. And I think you really, benefit from professional help from somebody that has sort of a trauma-focused therapeutic approach that understands the nature of trauma, understands about addiction and recovery, and can help you find a good balance on how do you manage the feelings without getting too overwhelmed, and how do you take care of your sobriety at the same time. So if you're wrestling with issues like that, definitely check out a therapist. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and inspiring, and I encourage you to take steps towards addressing some of these issues if you're experiencing them in your life. If there's other topics that you would like me to do videos on, please post them in the comments section below. I've included links for other videos I think you might find helpful, so I encourage you to check them out. Please click on the subscribe button to help me grow this channel. Finally, remember, now is always the time to start making positive changes in your life. I'll see you next time.